Tonight on Fear Knocks. Out here, deep in Alaska's winter, things get real fast. At negative 30 degrees Celsius, the world goes quiet in a way that feels intentional. Like the dark is listening for you to slip. People who live this far off grid don't scare easy. But even they have moments they refuse to talk about unless the stove's hot and the doors are bolted. And the ones talking tonight? They know exactly what it means when something steps onto your porch after midnight. Or when a frozen handle warms like someone just tested it. These aren't camp stories. These are the voices of people who learned that in this kind of cold, anything approaching your cabin either has a reason or shouldn't exist at all. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. We drop new horror every day. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. It helps the channel grow and keeps new episodes coming nightly. All right, let's get into it. I was preparing to run my main trapline when the first light touched the snow. It was a typical Alaskan winter morning, well below freezing. I noticed something unusual on the porch of my cabin. My cabin sits deep in the boreal timber, not far from Fairbanks, but far enough that the nearest neighbor is a long snow machine ride away. I am a trapper, and my life revolves around the rhythms of the forest, the cold, and the quiet. Each season brings its own challenges and its own isolation. This particular winter had been especially harsh, with temperatures consistently dropping to around 30 degrees below 0 Celsius. The air was always sharp, and the snow squeaked underfoot with every step. My routine was precise. Wake before dawn, check the stove, brew coffee, then head out to check my lines. I kept a logbook of everything, from trap catches to fuel consumption. The cabin itself was a simple structure, built for function, with a small porch facing east. That morning, the sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the frozen landscape. I stepped out onto the porch, my breath hissing in the frigid air. The snow on the porch boards was undisturbed, a fresh layer from a light fall overnight. Except for one detail. There were footprints. They started at the edge of the porch, near the steps, and curved around toward the cabin door. My first thought was an animal, perhaps a wolverine or a large fox, but the prints were too distinct, too evenly spaced. They were clearly bipedal. I knelt, my headlamp cutting through the dim light, illuminating the details. The prints were larger than my own winter boots, and the stride length seemed unusually long. My usual morning routine involved a quick check of the perimeter, then a long trek out to the traps. Today, that routine was interrupted. I retrieved my tape measure from the gear shed. The porch boards themselves served as a convenient ruler. I measured the distance between the heel strike of one print and the next. It was consistently longer than my own comfortable stride, even when I tried to stretch my steps. The prints were deep, indicating a heavy weight, or perhaps a rapid pace. What struck me most was the pattern. There was an inbound line of prints, leading from the edge of the porch to the door, and then an outbound arc, turning away from the cabin and heading back towards the forest. The wind, which had picked up slightly during the night, had filled the inbound line with a fine dusting of snow, softening their edges. Yet, the outbound arc remained remarkably clear, as if made more recently, or perhaps protected from the wind's direct path. I stood there for a few minutes, the cold seeping into my gear, trying to make sense of it. No one else should have been here. My nearest neighbor was a day's journey by snow machine. The trail leading to my cabin was a single track, one I maintained myself. There were no fresh snow machine tracks. The only way in or out was on foot or by air, and I had heard no aircraft. The isolation of the forest pressed in around me. The hum of the generator, usually a comforting sound, now seemed distant, almost swallowed by the vast quiet. I took out my small digital camera and began to photograph the prints, capturing their size, depth, and the peculiar way the snow had affected them. This was not an animal. This was a person. I approached the cabin door slowly, my hand on the axe handle I kept nearby. The door was a heavy, insulated slab of wood, secured with a robust latch. I checked the handle. It was cold, as expected, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible frost pattern on the metal. It looked like the imprint of a bare hand, or a gloved hand that had transferred heat. The frost was thin, delicate, and already beginning to refreeze into a uniform layer. This suggested the handle had been touched, and recently, before the extreme cold had fully reasserted itself. The timing was crucial. If the prints were made in the early hours and the handle touched then, the frost would have had time to form and then begin to dissipate or refreeze. I entered the cabin, my senses on high alert. The interior was undisturbed. My stove still held a low fire, radiating a steady heat. Nothing was out of place. I checked the windows, looking for any signs of forced entry or tampering. The frost on the inside panes was thick, as always, but there were no marks. I went to my radio. It was a shortwave unit, my only reliable link to the outside world. I tried to raise dispatch in Talkeetna, but the static was heavy. The aurora borealis had been active the previous night, often causing interference. I logged the incident in my logbook, detailing the prints, the measurements, and the frost on the door handle. I included the time of my discovery and the ambient temperature. I spent the next hour meticulously documenting the scene. I made plaster casts of the clearest prints, a skill I had learned years ago for tracking game. The casts confirmed the unusual length and width. I compared them to my own boot prints, made deliberately in the fresh snow nearby. The difference was stark. My boots were a men's size 10, and these prints suggested something much larger, or someone with an exceptionally long stride. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, searching for any other evidence. The outbound arc of prints led directly into the dense forest, disappearing among the snow-laden spruce and birch. There were no other tracks, no drag marks, nothing to indicate a snowshoe or ski. It was as if the person had simply walked out of the woods, approached my cabin, tested the door, and then walked back into the woods, leaving no other trace. The silence of the forest felt different now. It was no longer just quiet, it was watchful. I checked my rifle, ensuring it was loaded and accessible. The radio continued to crackle with static, offering no clear channel. I tried a few more times, hoping to reach a neighbor, anyone who might be listening. The relay delays were frustrating. I considered taking my snow machine out to follow the tracks, but the thought of venturing deeper into the forest, alone, with an unknown presence potentially ahead, gave me pause. The tracks were already fading, the wind slowly filling them in. I decided to wait, to observe, to maintain my position. As the day progressed, the light shifted and the shadows deepened. The cold remained relentless. I kept the cabin well heated, the stove popping occasionally, creating illusions of movement in the periphery of my vision. Every creak of the timber, every gust of wind against the walls, made me pause and listen. I reviewed the photographs I had taken, zooming in on the details of the prints, the subtle variations in the snow. The evidence was clear, undeniable. Someone had been here. Someone had approached my isolated cabin in the dead of winter, on foot, and then vanished back into the forest. Late that afternoon, the static on the radio finally cleared enough for me to make contact. I reached a small community about 100 miles south. I relayed my report, detailing the incident, the prints, and the lack of any other sign. The dispatcher logged my call, promising to pass the information to the nearest RCMP detachment. I knew it would be days, if not longer, before anyone could respond, given the remote location and the weather conditions. I kept my rifle close, and I slept fitfully, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. The next morning, the snow had drifted, covering the remaining tracks. The forest had reclaimed its secrets. I never saw those prints again, nor did I ever find any further evidence. The RCMP eventually sent a patrol out a few weeks later, but by then, the snow had completely reset. They took my statement, reviewed my logbook entries, and examined the plaster casts. The report was filed, categorized as an unexplained trespass. The incident became another entry in the long history of strange occurrences in the Alaskan wilderness. The isolation of the forest still feels different to me now. I still check the porch every morning, looking for any disturbance in the snow. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I can almost hear the faint whisper of footsteps against the grain. I was performing my evening check of the wood stove, ensuring the damper was set for the long night. It was late winter in the interior of Alaska, and the air outside held a sharp, deep cold, well below freezing. A faint, irregular hum seemed to resonate from the frozen ground beyond the cabin walls. My role as a cabin caretaker in this remote stretch of boreal timber, not far from Talkeetna, involved a strict routine. The nearest paved highway was a long snow machine ride away, and the only other human presence was miles down a single-track trail. The hum was unusual. It was not the familiar drone of a distant generator or the static from the old radio. This sound was low, almost a vibration, felt more than heard, and it seemed to pulse with an uneven rhythm. I stepped outside onto the small porch, pulling my heavy parka tight against the biting air. The frost on the railing glittered under the weak beam of my headlamp. I listened intently, but the sound faded as soon as I focused on it, leaving only the vast, deep silence of the Alaskan night. The cold pressed in, a physical weight, and I retreated inside, making a mental note of the anomaly. My days followed a predictable pattern, dictated by the relentless cold and the demands of maintaining an off-grid cabin. Each morning I would split firewood, clear snow from the entry, and check the fuel levels for the generator, though it rarely ran. The wood stove was the heart of the cabin, its steady warmth a constant against the outside world. I kept a detailed logbook of stove temperatures, fuel consumption, and any unusual observations. This meticulous record-keeping was part of the job, a way to track the cabin's performance and ensure everything remained operational. The nearest repeater station for the two-way radio was about 30 miles away, and I performed a radio check twice a day, logging the time and signal strength. These checks were vital for safety and communication, a lifeline to the outside world. The isolation here was profound, a constant presence, but it was also predictable. I had grown accustomed to the quiet, the way the forest held its breath under a blanket of snow, and the occasional whisper of the aurora borealis across the night sky. My senses had sharpened over the seasons, attuned to the subtle shifts in the environment, distinguishing the sound of a snowshoe hare from a larger animal, or the groan of settling ice on the nearby creek from a branch snapping under a heavy snow load. On this particular night, the temperature had dropped significantly, well below minus 30 degrees Celsius. I had just finished my final stove check, noting the internal temperature was holding steady, just as it should. The hum I had heard earlier had not returned. I was preparing for bed when I heard it, A distinct, soft click from the front door latch. It was not the sound of the wind rattling the door, which I knew well. This was a deliberate, mechanical sound, a brief engagement and disengagement of the latch mechanism. I froze, listening. The cabin was silent again, save for the gentle tick of the cooling stove. I waited for a long moment, my breath held. Nothing. My first thought was that the extreme cold might be causing the metal to contract, creating an unusual sound. I decided to investigate. I moved quietly to the door, my hand reaching for the metal latch. As my bare thumb made contact, I felt an unexpected warmth, a distinct lack of the usual icy chill that permeated every metal surface in such temperatures. It was a fleeting sensation, a warmth that suggested recent human contact. I pulled my hand back, a prickle of unease spreading through me. I quickly grabbed my infrared thermometer from the shelf near the door. Pointing it at the latch, the display showed a reading of barely above freezing, around 0 degrees Celsius. This was highly unusual. Every other metal surface in the cabin, including the door handle on the inside, registered well below 0. I pressed the timer on my watch, noting the exact moment of the reading. I watched the latch, my headlamp beam fixed on its surface. Within minutes, I saw a thin film of frost begin to form, rapidly spreading across the metal. I took another reading. The temperature had plummeted, now showing a reading consistent with the ambient cabin temperature, well below freezing. The latch had thawed and refrozen in a remarkably short period, perhaps 3 minutes. I checked the outside of the door, peering through the small frosted pane. The porch light was off, as always. I switched it on. The light illuminated the fresh snow on the porch and the steps leading down to the trail. There were no fresh tracks visible in the pristine snow. The only marks were my own from earlier in the day. I opened the door just a crack, letting in a blast of frigid air, and scanned the immediate perimeter with my headlamp. The forest was still, the snow undisturbed. I closed the door, my mind racing. The rapid refreeze was the most unsettling detail. It implied a direct, recent heat source, a hand on the latch, then a quick departure. I went to my camera, a digital model I used for documenting wildlife and cabin conditions. I checked its internal clock. It was off by exactly 2 minutes compared to the time I had logged from the local repeater station during my last radio check. This drift was not normal. I had synchronized it just a few days prior. The repeater logs were always accurate, a reliable time source. I spent the next hour meticulously examining the door and the surrounding area. I used a small brush to carefully collect any frost patterns from the latch, placing them into a sample bag, though I knew the evidence was likely compromised by my initial touch. I took photographs of the refrozen latch, documenting the frost patterns and the IR thermometer readings. I checked the snow around the cabin again, walking a wide perimeter with my headlamp, looking for any disturbance, any sign of a snowshoe print or a ski track. The snow was deep and untouched, a smooth, unbroken expanse. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the distant, faint hum that seemed to return intermittently, a low thrumming that was just at the edge of hearing. It was not the hum of power lines. There were none here. It was a sound I could not identify. I returned to the cabin, my mind replaying the sequence of events. The latch click, the warmth, the rapid refreeze, the camera clock drift. Each piece of data was small, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate, unexplainable interference. I reviewed my stove log, checking the temperature readings for the past few hours. Everything was consistent. The cabin's internal temperature had remained stable. There was no internal event that could explain the localized warmth on the latch. I then checked the radio logs, comparing the repeater time with my camera's internal clock. The 2-minute discrepancy was consistent across several recent entries. It was a small deviation, but in this environment, precision was often critical. I considered the possibility of an animal, perhaps a large bear, but the deliberate nature of the latch click and the human-like warmth made that highly improbable. A bear would have left clear tracks or attempted to force the door. This felt different, more subtle, more precise. I thought about the neighbor who lived about 3 miles down the trail. He sometimes passed by on his Skidoo, but he always announced his presence on the radio. There had been no radio traffic. I compiled a detailed report, noting all my observations, the IR thermometer readings, the timer logs, and the camera clock discrepancy. I included the photographs of the refrozen latch. This report would go into the cabin's official file, a record of unusual incidents. There was no immediate explanation for any of it. The incident remained an open question, a data point without a clear cause. The cold continued to hold the cabin in its grip, and the silence outside seemed deeper, more watchful. I felt a lingering sense of unease, a quiet dread that settled in the corners of the cabin. The procedural nature of my work demanded an explanation, but none was forthcoming. I still think about that night sometimes, the feel of that fleeting warmth on the metal latch. The cold here is absolute, and any deviation from its rule stands out. I listen for that low hum, and sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, I think I hear it again, just at the edge of perception. I was running my trapline that evening, checking snares along the frozen creek. The air was still and cold, barely above -30 degrees Celsius. A faint light moved across the frozen creek, where no light should have been. My cabin sat a few miles north of Fairbanks, deep in the boreal forest. This was late winter, a time when the days were still short and the nights long and clear. The creek formed a wide oxbow near the edge of my property, a place I knew well. I had just finished rebaiting a martin box when I saw it. A single dim headlight, low to the snow, tracing a path across the ice. It was moving steadily, heading west towards the main trail that led to the highway. My first thought was a late trapper, or perhaps someone from the nearby cabins. But the light was too faint, almost diffused, and there was no sound. Not the whine of an engine, not the crunch of snow under tracks. Nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the forest settling in the cold. I watched it for a long moment, the light a small, persistent glow against the vast, dark expanse of the frozen creek. It moved with a strange gliding motion, never faltering. The lack of sound was the most unsettling detail. Every snow machine, even at a distance, carries a distinct engine note across the still winter air. This one offered only silence. My routine in this part of Alaska was built on observation and a deep understanding of the land. I lived a solitary life, but not an isolated one. My nearest neighbor, a man named Thomas, lived about 3 miles further west, across the same creek oxbow. He maintained an off-grid cabin, relying on a wood stove and a small generator for power. Thomas was meticulous about security, especially after a few incidents of trespassers on remote properties. He had installed a sensitive microphone near his cabin's perimeter, wired to a recorder, specifically to pick up any unusual sounds. This system was a common practice among us, a way to monitor our remote properties when we were away or asleep. We often discussed the nuances of these setups, comparing sensitivity levels and battery life. The microphone was designed to capture even the softest sounds, a branch snapping, an animal's footsteps, or the distinct approach of a snow machine. We knew the sound profiles of everything that moved through our territory. The cold itself often amplified sounds, carrying them further than one might expect. A distant snow machine could be heard for miles on a clear, still night. I stood there for a few minutes, my breath pluming in the frigid air, watching the light. It continued its silent journey across the creek, moving with a steady, unhurried pace. It was definitely a snow machine, or at least something that resembled one. The light was too low for a person walking with a headlamp, and the speed was consistent with a sled. It reached the far bank of the Oxbow, climbed the gentle slope, and then disappeared into the dense spruce forest. The entire crossing took perhaps a minute or two. The absence of engine noise, the complete lack of any mechanical hum, continued to bother me. I knew the sound of every machine in the area, and this was unlike anything I had ever heard. The silence felt unnatural, a void in the expected soundscape of the winter night. I pulled out my satellite phone, the cold metal biting my ear. I called Thomas. He answered quickly, his voice a little groggy. I described what I had just seen, the dim light, the silent crossing. He listened patiently, then promised to check his perimeter microphone recordings. His cabin was directly in the path of where the light had disappeared. He would review the audio from the last hour, specifically looking for any snow machine activity. We agreed to talk again in about an hour. I finished my trapline checks, my mind still replaying the silent passage. The cold seemed to deepen, and the forest felt heavier around me. The thought of something moving through the wilderness without a trace of sound was unsettling. About an hour later, Thomas called me back. His voice was tight, a little strained. He had reviewed the audio from his cabin microphone. He reported nothing. Absolutely nothing. The recording showed only the usual ambient sounds of a winter night. The faint creak of his cabin timbers contracting in the cold. The occasional pop and hiss of his wood stove. The whisper of wind through the willow thickets near the creek. There was no engine noise, no track crunch, no human voice. No sound that could possibly be attributed to a snow machine. He had even amplified the recording, listening for the faintest static or hum. But there was only silence where a machine should have been. He sounded genuinely disturbed. Thomas was a practical man, not prone to exaggeration. He suggested I come over in the morning, after first light, to examine the tracks. He wanted to see if anything had actually crossed the creek. The idea of a visual sighting with no corresponding audio was deeply unsettling to both of us. It defied the basic physics of our environment. I agreed to meet him. The rest of the night felt long. Every shadow seemed to hold a new meaning. The cold pressed in, and the silence outside my cabin felt profound, almost oppressive. I kept imagining that dim light, gliding across the ice, leaving no audible trace. The next morning, the sky was a pale, clear blue, the air still sharp with cold. I packed my gear, including a camera and a measuring tape, and headed towards Thomas's cabin. The snow was fresh from a light fall a few days prior, perfect for showing tracks. I followed my own snow machine trail, the engine a reassuring rumble beneath me. When I reached the creek Oxbow, I slowed down, scanning the snow. My eyes immediately found them. Clear, distinct snow machine tracks leading up from the far bank of the creek, exactly where I had seen the light disappear into the trees. The tracks were well defined, showing the pattern of a standard sled's cleats and skis. They continued for about 50 yards into the forest before fading into a denser, wind-blown area where the snow was shallower. I took several photographs, documenting the track width and depth. The evidence was undeniable. Something had indeed crossed the creek. Then I turned my attention to the creek itself. I drove my snow machine carefully onto the ice, then dismounted, walking slowly, methodically, back towards my own property. I searched the entire width of the oxbow, from Thomas's side to mine. I looked for any sign of tracks leading onto the ice from my side or anywhere else. I found nothing. The snow on the creek was pristine, undisturbed. There were no tracks approaching the point where the visible tracks began on the far bank. It was as if the snow machine had simply materialized on the ice, crossed, and then vanished into the forest. I walked the entire length of the oxbow, examining every drift, every patch of snow. The surface was smooth, unbroken, save for the occasional animal trail of a fox or a rabbit. The lack of approach tracks was impossible. A snow machine leaves a clear, heavy impression. It cannot simply appear. I spent another hour meticulously surveying the area, casting for any faint impression, any disturbance in the frost. There was nothing. I took more photographs, documenting the pristine snow leading up to the point where the tracks abruptly began. I met Thomas at his cabin. He had already reviewed the audio again, with the same result. We compared my photographs of the tracks with the absolute silence on his recordings. The discrepancy was stark, a physical impossibility. We discussed every logical explanation. Perhaps the machine had been lifted by a helicopter? But there was no sign of a landing, no disturbed snow, no rotor wash. Perhaps it was an experimental, silent snow machine? But even those make some sound, a hum, a whine, and they are not typically found on remote Alaskan traplines. We considered a trick of light, a reflection, but the tracks were real, tangible evidence. We filed a report with the local authorities, detailing the visual sighting, the lack of audio evidence, and the impossible track pattern. The RCMP officer who took the report listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He noted it down, but there was little he could do. No crime had been committed, no property damaged. It was simply an anomaly, a strange incident in the vast, quiet wilderness. The report was logged, a file opened, but no further action was taken. The incident remained unexplained, a quiet, unsettling entry in my personal logbook. The memory of that dim light, gliding silently across the frozen creek, still returns to me sometimes. The cold, the vastness of the forest, the absolute silence of that night. I still hear the stove ticks on Thomas's recording, and the whisper of the wind through the willows, but never the sound of the machine. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and which moment hit you the hardest. I always check. I was a volunteer radio operator, monitoring the repeater network. It was late winter, well past midnight, and the cabin was deep in the Alaskan boreal forest. A faint burst of static on the frequency was the first indication something was amiss. My shift had begun hours earlier, just after sunset. The air outside had dropped to well below freezing, a typical temperature for the region near Fairbanks. Inside the small cabin, the wood stove radiated a steady warmth, its occasional pop and crackle the only consistent sound against the general hush. My station was set up on a small table by the single window, the handheld VHF radio connected to an external antenna. The window glass was thick with frost, obscuring the dark forest beyond. My logbook lay open, ready for entries. My role was to monitor the remote repeater, relaying messages for trappers, prospectors, and other isolated residents across the vast, frozen landscape. It was a quiet duty, mostly uneventful. but essential for safety and communication in such an isolated environment. The radio's low hum was a constant, reassuring presence. The static burst was brief, a quick squelch that faded before I could identify any voice or signal. I noted it in the logbook, a minor anomaly. The night continued its slow progression. The aurora borealis had begun to shimmer faintly in the northern sky, casting a pale, shifting light that barely penetrated the frosted window. The cold outside was profound, a deep, still cold that seemed to absorb all sound. I checked the stove, adding another piece of birch, and watched the flames dance behind the glass. The cabin was a small island of warmth and light in a vast, dark wilderness. My routine involved hourly checks, a quick key-up to confirm the repeater was active, and a scan of the common frequencies. This was standard procedure, a way to ensure the system was operational and to log any unusual activity. Around a little past 1 in the morning, I performed another routine check. I keyed the microphone, stating my call sign and the time. I released the key, and the room fell silent again, save for the low hum of the stove. The air felt still, the kind of stillness that precedes a heavy snowfall or an extreme drop in temperature. Then, after a pause that felt too long, the repeater keyed back. It was my own voice, my exact words played back. The squelch burst was identical, the cadence the same. The message was a clipped repetition of my last transmission. The only difference was the delay, a full 10 seconds after I had finished speaking. The sound came from the repeater, located on a ridge about 3 miles behind the cabin, a familiar direction. I sat motionless for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. My hand remained on the radio. The frost on the window seemed to thicken, reflecting the dim glow of the cabin light. I checked the logbook, noting the precise time of the transmission and the unusual delay. My training had covered various repeater malfunctions, but a delayed, mirrored transmission was not among them. I considered atmospheric conditions, but the night was clear, cold, and still. There was no fog or heavy cloud cover that might explain such an echo. The forest outside remained dark, a solid wall of boreal timber. The isolation of the cabin suddenly felt more pronounced. I decided to test the system again. I keyed the microphone with a short, clear message, a simple radio check. I released the key. The repeater responded instantly, its squelch burst followed by my own voice without any delay. I tried again, varying my tone and message length. Each time the repeater functioned as expected, a normal, immediate relay. The initial delayed response remained an isolated incident, yet it felt significant. I looked out the frosted window, trying to discern anything in the impenetrable darkness. The faint glow of the aurora offered no answers, only a silent, indifferent light. The cold pressed against the cabin walls. I reviewed the logbook entries from earlier in the night. The faint static burst I had noted hours before now seemed less random. It was a small, almost imperceptible detail, but it connected to the later event. I considered the possibility of another operator on the frequency, perhaps keying up at the exact moment I released my own, but the mirrored transmission of my own words made that unlikely. It was not a crosstalk or an accidental overlap. It was a precise, delayed echo. The hum of the radio seemed louder in the quiet room. I felt a prickle of unease, a quiet dread that settled in the back of my mind. I decided to conduct a more thorough check. I went outside, pulling on my heavy parka and insulated boots. The air hit me with a sharp, biting cold, well below zero. My breath plumed instantly in the still air. The snow crunched loudly under my boots as I moved away from the cabin, towards the edge of the tree line. I carried a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the absolute darkness. The forest was silent, utterly devoid of sound. There was no wind, no rustling of branches, no animal calls. The only sound was the faint creak of the cabin in the distance and the crunch of my own footsteps. I walked a short distance along the snow-covered trail that led to the main trapper line. I scanned the ground for tracks, looking for anything that might indicate recent passage. The snow was pristine, undisturbed except for the occasional print of a rabbit or a fox. There were no human tracks, no sign of a snow machine or any other vehicle. The cold was intense, seeping through my layers despite the heavy insulation. I stood for a few minutes, listening, trying to detect any sound beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin. The silence was profound, almost oppressive. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I returned to the cabin, stamping the snow from my boots on the small porch. The door handle was cold to the touch, a thin layer of frost already forming on the metal. Inside, the warmth of the stove was a welcome relief. I sat back down at the radio, my mind replaying the sequence of events. The delayed transmission was not a simple technical glitch. It was too precise, too specific. It felt like an intentional act, a response. The thought was unsettling. I considered calling dispatch, but what would I report? A 10-second echo of my own voice? It sounded absurd, almost like a trick of the mind. Yet, I knew what I had heard. I spent the rest of my shift monitoring the frequency with heightened attention. Every squelch burst, every flicker of static made me pause. The night remained quiet, the repeater silent except for my own occasional checks. The aurora faded as dawn approached, replaced by the faint gray light of a winter morning. The frost on the window began to melt slightly, revealing a blurred view of the snow-covered trees. I logged my final entry, detailing the unusual incident and my subsequent checks. The logbook was a factual record, devoid of speculation or personal feelings. It simply stated what occurred. I filed a detailed report with the network coordinator the following day. The technical team reviewed the repeater logs remotely. They found no anomalies in the system's performance during that period. The equipment was fully functional, and there were no records of any other transmissions that could explain the delay. The incident was noted in a file, categorized as an unexplained atmospheric anomaly or a transient equipment glitch. There was no evidence of trespass, no tracks, no other reports from the area. The official explanation was technical, procedural, and ultimately unsatisfying. The memory of that night remains clear. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the cabin creaks, I still hear that echo. It is a quiet reminder of something out there, listening, waiting. I was on night watch, monitoring the perimeter sensors from inside the cabin. It was a deep winter night, well below freezing, with fresh snow covering the ground outside. A faint, hollow sound came from the porch, a sound that did not register on the sensors. My shift had just begun, a routine check of the remote station near Talkeetna. The cabin was a small, single-room structure, built for observation and data collection in extreme isolation. Outside, the forest was still, blanketed by a recent snowfall. The air held a sharp, biting cold. The sound was distinct, a soft rap against wood. It happened again, a second time, then a third. Each knock was quiet, deliberate, spaced a few seconds apart. I paused my logbook entry, listening intently. The cabin's interior was warm, the wood stove radiating a steady heat. I could hear the gentle hum of the ventilation system, The only other sound was the occasional creak of the old timber settling in the deep cold. I checked the sensor readouts again. Nothing. No motion, no thermal signature, no pressure changes near the porch. The system was designed to detect even small animals, like a snowshoe hare or a fox. This absence of data was the first anomaly that night. The quiet persistence of the knocking felt out of place, a deliberate act in the deep wilderness. My role involved maintaining the equipment and recording environmental data. This outpost was situated deep within the boreal timber, accessible only by a single-track trail during winter. Supplies arrived by snow machine, weather permitting. Isolation was a constant factor here. The nearest highway was many miles away, and the closest human settlement was a small cluster of trapper cabins, mostly empty this time of year. Radio communication was our primary link to dispatch, often subject to delays and static due to the terrain and aurora activity. My routine was precise. I would check the external cameras every hour, log temperature readings, and monitor the radio for any traffic. The nights were long, stretching for many hours during the winter months. The cabin's only light came from a few LED lamps and the glow of the stove. I had grown accustomed to the sounds of the forest at night. The wind through the spruce, the distant cry of an owl, the settling of snow. I knew the difference between an animal brushing against the cabin and the creak of ice. The sensor array was robust, designed to detect anything larger than a squirrel within a perimeter of about 50 feet. This specific sequence of 3 soft knocks was unfamiliar. It did not fit any known pattern of natural sounds, nor did it trigger any of our calibrated detection systems. I waited for a few minutes, my hand resting on the radio's microphone. The cabin remained silent, save for the low hum of the electronics. I considered calling it in, but without any sensor data, it would be difficult to explain. A false alarm was something I tried to avoid. I decided to observe further. I moved quietly to the small window facing the porch. The glass was thick, double-paned, with a thin layer of frost forming along the edges. I could see the porch floor, covered in a fresh, undisturbed layer of powder. The moonlight, filtered through a light fog, cast long, soft shadows from the surrounding trees. There were no tracks visible on the pristine surface. Just as I was about to turn away, a sharp pop echoed from the wood stove. It was the sound of metal expanding rapidly from the heat, a common occurrence in the extreme cold. The stovepipe cap rattled once, a distinct metallic ping. This was also normal. What was not normal was the timing. The pop and the subsequent rattle happened immediately after the third knock. It felt too precise, too coincidental. I had heard the stove pop countless times, but never in such a direct sequence with an external sound. The internal temperature gauge on the stove showed a steady reading, indicating no sudden change in combustion. I activated the external audio recorder, a sensitive directional microphone mounted near the porch. It was designed to capture ambient forest sounds, but it could also pick up closer disturbances. I let it run for several minutes, hoping to catch any further sounds. The silence that followed was profound. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I checked the window again. The snow remained pristine. The cold outside was intense, a deep chill that seeped through the cabin walls despite the insulation. I could feel the temperature difference near the window pane. I reviewed the audio recording from the last few minutes. The 3 distinct knocks were there, faint but clear. The knocks possessed a dull thud against the solid timber. Then, the sharp of the stove, followed by the single rattle of the cap. The recording confirmed what I had heard. There was no other sound before or after the knocks, no rustling, no footsteps on the porch, nothing to indicate an approach or a departure. It was as if the sound had simply materialized. This lack of any other auditory evidence made the incident more unsettling. It defied logical explanation. I spent the next hour monitoring the perimeter with heightened vigilance. I scanned the camera feeds, looking for any movement in the shadows. The infrared view showed the heat signatures of distant animals, a deer perhaps, or a small group of elk moving through the deeper forest. Nothing close to the cabin. The fresh powder remained untouched. The air outside was still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every small sound. I considered the possibility of an animal, but the knocks were too deliberate, too evenly spaced. No animal I knew could produce such a sound without leaving tracks or triggering a sensor. The incident replayed in my mind. 3 soft knocks, then the stove pop, then the cap rattle. The sequence was burned into my memory. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a branch, heavy with snow, had fallen against the porch railing. But the sound was too uniform, too consistent. It sounded like knuckles on wood, and the timing with the stove was too perfect. I logged the event in my report, detailing the sounds, the lack of sensor data, and the pristine snow. I noted the exact time of the incident, referring to it as a little past midnight. The isolation of the cabin felt heavier now, the silence more oppressive. I kept the radio on, listening to the low static hum, a faint connection to the outside world. I maintained my watch until dawn, checking the perimeter every few minutes. The night passed without further incident. The sun eventually rose, casting a pale light over the frozen landscape. The temperature remained well below freezing. I prepared for my morning routine, which included a full exterior inspection. This was standard procedure, especially after a night with unusual activity. I grabbed my camera and a small evidence kit. Stepping out onto the porch, the cold air immediately bit at my exposed skin. I pulled my hood tighter. The snow was still undisturbed, a smooth white blanket. I walked slowly, examining every inch of the porch floor. No footprints, no indentations, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. I took several photographs of the pristine snow, documenting the lack of tracks. I moved to the side of the cabin, checking the windows and walls. Everything appeared normal. As I rounded the corner to the front door, I noticed something. Underneath the kickplate, where the cabin wall met the porch floor, there was a faint mark. It was a shallow scrape in the fresh powder, barely visible. The mark was about the length of a boot sole, perhaps a little longer. It was a single distinct impression, not a full footprint, but a drag or a slide. The snow around it was slightly compressed, but not enough to leave a clear outline of a boot tread. It was as if something had been pushed or scraped along the ground, just under the overhang of the kickplate. I knelt down, examining the mark closely. It was too small to be from an animal. A bear would leave a much larger, deeper impression. A wolf or a fox would leave paw prints. This was consistent with a human boot, but only a partial, obscured mark. The location was also peculiar. It was directly beneath the kickplate, a spot that would be sheltered from any light snowfall or wind. This suggested it had been made after the fresh powder had fallen, but before the sun had risen. The implications of that single mark were unsettling. I took several close-up photographs of the scrape using a small ruler for scale. I also took wider shots to show its relation to the porch and the cabin wall. The snow around the scrape was refrozen, indicating it had been there for some time, likely since the incident during the night. The frost on the cabin wall above the kickplate was undisturbed. There were no other marks leading to or from this single scrape. It was an isolated piece of evidence, appearing as if from nowhere. I spent another hour meticulously searching the surrounding area. I walked a wide circle around the cabin, checking the perimeter trail and the nearby forest edge. The snow was deep in places, making travel difficult. I found no other tracks, no broken branches, no signs of passage. The trail leading to the cabin was also clear, its surface showing only my own snow machine tracks from the previous day. The forest remained silent and vast. The evidence was limited to that single, partial scrape under the kickplate. It was a physical confirmation that something had been there, despite the sensors and the pristine snow. I returned inside and immediately filed a detailed report with dispatch. I attached the audio recording of the knocks and the stove pop, along with the photographs of the boot scrape. I described the lack of sensor activation and the undisturbed snow on the porch. The dispatcher acknowledged the report, stating they would log it and review the evidence. They advised me to remain vigilant and to report any further activity immediately. The official response was measured, given the logistical challenges involved. The incident was officially logged as an unexplained perimeter disturbance. There was no follow-up investigation in person due to the remote location and the limited nature of the evidence. The state troopers would not deploy for a single boot scrape and an audio recording without more substantial cause. My logbook entries from that night became part of the official file. I continued my shift, but the sense of isolation had deepened. The cabin, once a familiar refuge, now felt exposed. The memory of those 3 soft knocks, followed by the metallic ping of the stove, stayed with me. I still hear it sometimes, especially on cold, clear nights when the wind is still. The image of that single, partial scrape under the kickplate also remains vivid. It was a small piece of evidence, easily overlooked, but it confirmed something had been there. The wilderness holds its secrets tightly, and sometimes it offers only the most subtle hints. I was checking the trapline when the first sign appeared. It was a clear, cold afternoon in late December, the air barely above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. A faint, irregular crunching sound carried on the wind from the frozen creek. My cabin sits deep in the boreal timber of interior Alaska, not far from the Susitna River. The nearest highway is a long drive, and the only access to my property is a single-track trail, passable by snow machine in winter. I had lived there for many years, accustomed to the isolation and the quiet hum of the forest. The crunching sound was distinct from the usual ice shifts or animal movements. It had a rhythmic quality, like heavy boots on packed snow. I stopped my snow machine and listened, cutting the engine to hear better. The silence that followed was immediate and profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the spruce branches. I waited for a few minutes, scanning the creek cut below. Nothing moved. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. I dismissed it as an echo, a trick of the cold air, a common occurrence in such extreme cold. I continued my rounds, but the sound lingered in my memory. This was my normal response to the strange sounds of the wilderness. I had learned to trust my senses, but also to question them, especially when the cold played tricks on sound. My routine was precise, dictated by the demands of off-grid living. Each morning began before dawn, stoking the wood stove, checking the generator, and monitoring the radio for any local traffic or weather advisories. The cabin was well insulated, a sturdy log structure I had built myself. It was designed to withstand the harsh Alaskan winters, a fortress against the elements. My days involved maintaining the property, clearing snow, chopping wood, and running my small trapper lines. I kept a detailed logbook of everything, from fuel consumption to animal sightings. This meticulous approach was essential for survival in such a remote location. Communication was limited to a satellite phone for emergencies and a two-way radio for local contact. Radio relay delays were common, especially during aurora activity. My nearest neighbor was about 15 miles away, a fellow trapper named Elias. We communicated infrequently, mostly about trail conditions or supply runs into Talkeetna. The forest was my constant companion, a vast, silent presence. I knew its sounds, its patterns, its subtle shifts. I understood the difference between a moose breaking brush and a branch snapping under heavy snow. The cold was a constant, tangible force, shaping every aspect of life. I relied on my observations, my experience, and a deep understanding of the environment. My world was one of quiet self-reliance, where every detail mattered. That evening, the temperature dropped significantly, well below zero. The air felt sharper, the kind of cold that makes metal brittle. I was inside, preparing dinner, when I heard it again. This time, it was closer, a distinct crunching from the direction of the creek cut, the oxbow bend that ran behind my property. I moved to the window, peering through the double-pane glass. The moon was a sliver, but the snow reflected enough light to illuminate the landscape in shades of gray and silver. The wind had picked up, creating a low, mournful whisper through the trees. Then I saw it. A single, focused beam of light, like a powerful LED flashlight, moving along the frozen creek. It was low to the ground, sweeping back and forth in a deliberate pattern. It was not a snow machine headlight. Those were wider, higher, and usually accompanied by engine noise. This light was silent, methodical. It moved slowly, tracing the edge of the creek bank, then out onto the ice. My breath fogged the window pane. I watched, unmoving, for what felt like several minutes. The light continued its path, unwavering. It was too steady for an animal, too controlled for a natural phenomenon. My mind immediately went through the possibilities. A lost hiker? Unlikely, given the extreme cold and the remoteness. A poacher? Possible, but they usually worked under cover of darkness, not with a bright light. A neighbor? Elias would have called on the radio. The light was now approaching the cluster of willow bushes that marked the narrowest point of the oxbow, about a quarter-mile from the cabin. It paused there for a moment, the beam sweeping across the dense thicket. Then it disappeared behind the willows. I waited for it to reappear on the other side. It did not. I stood at the window for a long time, straining my eyes, listening intently. The wind continued its low hum, but the crunching sound had stopped. The light was gone. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. I checked my rifle, ensuring it was loaded. My heart rate was elevated, a cold knot forming in my stomach. This was not an animal. This was not a natural occurrence. Someone was out there, on my property, in the deep cold, with a powerful light, moving silently. I moved through the cabin, turning off all interior lights. I grabbed my binoculars and returned to the window. The landscape was still and stark under the faint moonlight. The willows remained dark, unmoving. There was no sign of the light, no sound of movement. The isolation of the cabin, usually a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. I considered calling Elias, but the radio relay delays were unpredictable, and I had no immediate emergency. I needed more information. I spent the next few hours watching, periodically checking the creek. The cold outside intensified. The cabin felt warm and secure, but the image of that moving light was burned into my mind. I kept my rifle close, its cold steel a tangible presence. The stove popped and crackled, its sounds amplified in the quiet night, sometimes making me jump. I knew these were just the sounds of the cabin settling, but my nerves were frayed. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath. I did not sleep that night. At first light, the temperature was around 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. I dressed in my warmest gear, grabbed my flashlight, camera, and rifle, and stepped outside. The air bit at my exposed skin. I moved cautiously, scanning the perimeter of the cabin. The snow was undisturbed, a smooth, unbroken blanket. I walked towards the creek cut, following the faint outline of my own snowshoe tracks from the previous day. The ground was hard, frozen solid. As I approached the oxbow, I slowed my pace. The willows were still and stark. I moved around them, expecting to find tracks in the fresh snow, evidence of where the light had gone. There was nothing. The snow was pristine, untouched. No boot prints, no snow machine tracks, no sign of any passage. It was as if the light had simply vanished into the frozen air. I swept my flashlight beam across the area, looking for any disturbance, any anomaly. The surface of the creek ice was smooth, a sheet of glass. I spent about an hour meticulously searching the area. I took photographs of the undisturbed snow, documenting the lack of tracks. The absence of evidence was, in itself, a form of evidence. How could a person with a powerful flashlight move across the landscape without leaving a single trace in fresh snow at such extreme temperatures? It defied logic. I considered the possibility of a drone, but the light had been too low, too deliberate in its sweep, and the silence too absolute. I returned to the cabin, feeling a profound unease. The lack of tracks was more disturbing than finding them would have been. It implied a level of stealth or an unknown method of travel that I could not comprehend. I made a note in my logbook, detailing the time, temperature, and my observations. I also included a sketch of the light's path. Later that morning, as I was preparing to make a radio call to Elias, I noticed something on my porch rail. It was a small, dark patch on the skim ice that coated the wooden surface. The ice was thin, barely a millimeter thick, but it was uniform across the rail. This patch was different. It was a clear impression, about the size of a gloved hand, where the ice had softened and refrozen in a slightly different texture. It was a warm glove print. My blood ran cold. Someone had been on my porch. Someone had touched the rail. The temperature had been well below freezing all night, meaning the print had been made recently, likely in the last few hours, or during the time I was watching the creek. I immediately took photographs of the print, capturing its texture and location on the rail. I then carefully touched the area. The ice was now solid again, but the impression remained. I checked the door handle. It was also coated in a thin layer of frost, but there was no discernible print, no sign of it being tested. The implications were stark. While I was watching the creek, someone had approached my cabin, stood on my porch, and touched the rail. They had been close enough to test the door, perhaps. The silence of their approach was terrifying. No crunching footsteps, no sound at all. The light on the creek cut had been a distraction, a lure, or perhaps a signal. I immediately attempted to contact Elias on the radio. The static was heavy, and the relay was delayed. I tried again and again. After several attempts, I finally reached Elias. I relayed the incident in a calm, factual tone, describing the light, the lack of tracks, and the glove print on the porch rail. He listened quietly, his voice flat when he responded. He confirmed he had not seen any snow machine headlights or unusual activity in his area. He advised me to report it to the state troopers, even though they were a long way off. He also offered to come over, but I declined, not wanting to put him at risk. I filed a report with the state troopers via satellite phone. The dispatch officer took down my details, the time of the incident, and my observations. They informed me that, due to the remoteness and the lack of immediate danger, a patrol would not be dispatched immediately. They would log the incident and keep an eye out for any similar reports. I understood their position. My evidence was circumstantial: a moving light, no tracks, and a refrozen glove print. It was not enough for an immediate response. I continued to monitor my property, maintaining a heightened state of alert. I still live in the cabin. The incident remains an open file with the state troopers, filed under unexplained activity. I review the photographs of the glove print and the pristine snow regularly. The memory of that silent, moving light on the creek cut and the knowledge that someone stood on my porch still lingers. I check the perimeter more often now, and my rifle is always within reach. Every distant crunch, every whisper of the wind makes me pause and listen. The isolation feels different now, less comforting, more exposed. I was checking the perimeter of the remote property, a routine task I performed every morning. It was late winter in interior Alaska, the air still and cold beneath a pale sky. Then I heard a distinct metallic ping from the tool shed roof. The sound was sharp, a single, clear note that cut through the profound quiet of the boreal forest. I stopped walking, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The property was a few miles off the main highway, accessible only by a single-track trail that was often impassable without a snow machine. My job as caretaker involved maintaining the main cabin and several outbuildings, ensuring everything remained secure during the long, isolated winter months. The tool shed was a small, corrugated metal structure, barely larger than a single-car garage, set back among a stand of spruce trees. Its roof was a simple, low-pitched design, covered in galvanized tin. The ping had sounded exactly as if something had landed on it, or perhaps been stepped upon. I stood motionless for a long moment, listening. The only sounds were the faint creak of the frozen trees and the distant hum of the generator at the main cabin. There was no wind, no falling snow, nothing that could have caused the sound. The snow cover on the ground was undisturbed, a smooth, unbroken expanse of white powder. My routine began before dawn, a methodical process of checking fuel levels, clearing light snow from paths, and inspecting the integrity of all structures. This particular morning, the temperature had dropped well below freezing overnight, perhaps 30 degrees below zero, making the snow crisp and dry. The isolation was a constant companion here, a deep quiet that amplified every sound and made every anomaly stand out. I relied on a two-way radio for communication, a link to the outside world that often experienced delays due to the terrain and atmospheric conditions. The nearest neighbor was a trapper, about 3 miles down the trail, and I rarely saw him during the winter. My daily logbook entries were precise, detailing temperatures, fuel consumption, and any observations. This procedural approach helped maintain a sense of order in a place where nature held overwhelming sway. I walked slowly towards the shed, my boots crunching softly on the packed snow. The sun was just beginning to cast long, pale shadows through the forest, but the light was still weak. I kept my gaze fixed on the shed roof, searching for any sign of movement or disturbance. The corrugated tin gleamed faintly under the low light. As I approached, I could see the roof clearly. It was entirely covered in a thin, even layer of fresh powder snow, perhaps an inch deep, which had fallen sometime during the night. There were no indentations, no displaced snow, no tracks of any kind. The surface was perfectly smooth, an unbroken blanket of white. This observation immediately contradicted the sound I had heard. A ping like that, from a metal roof, would imply a weight, a sudden impact. Such an impact would certainly have left a mark in the soft, fresh snow. I circled the shed slowly, my eyes scanning the ground around its base. The snow here was also pristine, undisturbed. There were no animal tracks, no human footprints, nothing to suggest anything had approached the structure. The air remained perfectly still, the cold biting at my exposed skin. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face. The silence pressed in, now feeling less peaceful and more watchful. I stood for a few minutes, just observing, letting the cold seep into my boots. The lack of evidence was more unsettling than finding a set of tracks would have been. Tracks would have provided a tangible explanation. An animal, perhaps a curious fox or a squirrel, but the smooth snow offered no such comfort. It was as if the sound had simply manifested, a disembodied echo in the frozen air. I made a mental note to inspect the shed more closely later in the day when the light was better. For now, I continued my perimeter check, but my attention remained fixed on the small metal building. The incident felt like a whisper in the vast empty forest, a suggestion of something out of place. Later that morning, after completing my other duties, I returned to the shed. The sun was higher now, casting a brighter but still cold light. I retrieved a sturdy aluminum ladder from the main cabin and carried it over to the shed. The ladder felt heavy and cold in my gloved hands. I leaned it against the side of the shed, making sure it was stable on the frozen ground. I also brought my camera, a small digital model I used for documenting any issues or repairs. I wanted to photograph the roof, to have a record of its undisturbed state. The procedural aspect of my work demanded such documentation. I climbed the ladder slowly, carefully, the metal rungs biting into my gloves. Each step was deliberate, the cold air sharp in my lungs. From the top of the ladder, I could see the entire roof surface at eye level. The layer of powder snow was indeed perfectly smooth, an unbroken expanse. I took several photographs from different angles, capturing the pristine condition of the snow. There was no sign of any impact, no depression, no scrape, no displaced flakes. The tin itself showed no visible damage or deformation. It was exactly as it should be, except for the sound I had heard. I descended the ladder, feeling a growing unease. The absence of evidence was becoming a problem. It suggested something that defied simple explanation. I then began a more thorough inspection of the shed itself. I checked the walls, the foundation, the small window on one side. Everything appeared normal. Finally, I reached the door. It was a simple wooden door, secured with a heavy-duty steel latch plate and a padlock. I always check the security of all latches and locks as part of my routine. I knelt down, my knees pressing into the cold snow. The padlock was still in place, its shackle frozen solid. I ran my gloved hand over the steel latch plate. It was then that I felt it, a slight roughness under my fingertips. I removed my glove, exposing my bare hand to the biting cold, and touched the plate again. There was a fresh scuff mark, a bright, silvery scratch on the dark steel. It was a distinct, linear abrasion, consistent with the tip of a screwdriver or a similar prying tool. The mark was fresh, clearly made recently, as it stood out against the weathered patina of the old steel. It had not been there during my last check, just 2 days prior. The discovery sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. The shed had been tested. Someone had tried to force the latch. The ping on the roof, the undisturbed snow, and now this fresh scuff mark. The pieces did not fit together in a logical sequence. If someone had been on the roof, they would have left tracks. If they had tried to pry the latch, they would have been on the ground, leaving footprints in the snow. But there were no footprints anywhere. The only evidence was the scuff on the latch and the memory of that impossible sound. I took several close-up photographs of the scuff mark, documenting its size and location. I then used my radio to contact the local authorities, reporting a possible attempted break-in. The radio crackled with static before the dispatcher's voice came through, distant and slightly delayed. I gave them the details, emphasizing the lack of tracks and the strange roof sound. They advised me to secure the area and await further instructions. The wait was long. The isolation of the cabin pressed in, now feeling less like solitude and more like exposure. I kept the radio on, its low hum a constant presence. I spent the rest of the day inside the main cabin, periodically checking the trail with binoculars. I saw no headlights, no sign of anyone approaching. The forest remained still, silent, and watchful. The local authorities eventually sent a state trooper, who arrived late the following afternoon on a snow machine. He examined the shed, took his own photographs of the scuff mark, and walked the perimeter. He noted the lack of tracks in his report, a detail that clearly puzzled him. He suggested it might have been an animal, perhaps a wolverine, but admitted the scuff mark looked too precise for an animal. He filed a report, but there was little else to go on. No evidence of entry, no clear perpetrator. The incident was logged as an attempted trespass, but without a clear explanation. The trooper left, his snow machine fading into the distant hum of the forest. I was left with the cold facts: a fresh scuff on a steel latch, an inexplicable sound from a pristine roof, and no tracks in the snow. The official report offered no closure, only a record of an unsolved anomaly. The incident became a quiet, unsettling presence in my daily routine. I continued my checks, but now with a heightened sense of awareness. The feeling of being watched never fully dissipated. I still hear that sound sometimes, a faint metallic ping in the deep quiet of the Alaskan night. It echoes in my memory, a reminder of something that defied explanation, something that moved without leaving a trace. The cold air seems to carry it, a whisper from the forest. I was preparing my morning coffee, a routine I followed every day. The cabin was still settling from a night of extreme cold, the air outside barely above 30 degrees below zero. My attention drifted to the front door, where the handle appeared slightly off. This was not a dramatic shift, but a subtle one. The handle usually rested at a specific angle when fully closed, a habit I had observed for years. Now, it seemed to have moved a few degrees past its normal stop, a minor detail that caught my eye in the dim morning light. A thin halo of frost ringed the base of the handle, a common sight in such temperatures, but its pattern seemed disturbed, almost smeared. The cabin was my home, deep in the boreal timber of interior Alaska, not far from Fairbanks. I lived an isolated life, relying on my own observations and a deep understanding of my surroundings. This small discrepancy on the door handle immediately registered as an anomaly. The quiet hum of the generator outside was the only sound breaking the profound silence of the forest. I paused my coffee preparations, my gaze fixed on the handle, a quiet unease beginning to settle. My life here was built on routine and meticulous observation. Every morning, I checked the perimeter, noted the snow conditions, and listened to the distant sounds of the forest. My cabin was off-grid, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs designed to withstand the harsh Alaskan winters. The nearest paved highway was a long snow machine ride away, followed by a drive of about an hour. My only regular contact with the outside world came through a satellite radio, often subject to relay delays in this remote region. I maintained a logbook of daily temperatures, fuel consumption, and any unusual occurrences. This procedural approach to living in isolation was essential for survival and peace of mind. I had installed a small, low-power camera inside, pointed at the door, primarily to monitor for drafts or the occasional curious animal. It recorded only when motion was detected, saving power. The cold was a constant presence, shaping every decision, every movement. My wood stove provided warmth, its occasional pops and creaks a familiar comfort, sometimes creating illusions of other sounds in the deep night. I approached the door slowly, my breath misting in the cool cabin air. The frost on the handle was delicate, almost crystalline, but the faint smudging was undeniable. It suggested a recent touch, a pressure applied. I reached for my angle gauge, a small tool I used for various measurements around the cabin. Carefully, I placed it against the handle, noting the precise deviation from its usual resting point. It was indeed a few degrees past where it should have been. This was not a natural settling. I then checked the interior camera's memory card. The small screen flickered to life, showing a series of still frames from the previous night. Most frames showed only the subtle shimmer of a draft near the door frame, a common occurrence when temperatures dropped drastically. I scrolled through the images, looking for any distinct movement or change. The camera had captured nothing definitive. There was no clear image of the handle moving, no shadow passing, just the faint, almost imperceptible shift in the frost pattern. The last recorded motion event was hours earlier, a moth drawn to the interior light. I stepped outside, pulling on my heavy parka and insulated boots. The cold hit me immediately, a physical pressure that tightened my skin. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, a pristine blanket stretching into the forest. I walked a wide circle around the porch, searching for any tracks. The snow was deep and powdery, making clear impressions difficult, but I found nothing that suggested a human presence. There were tracks of a snowshoe hare, a fox, and the faint, almost invisible trail of a vole, but nothing else. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the frozen snow. I returned to the door, examining the frost on the handle again. It was already beginning to refreeze, obscuring the faint smudges. I took a photograph with my small digital camera, capturing the handle's position and the disturbed frost. This would go into my logbook. The incident itself was minor, almost insignificant, but the implications were not. Someone had tested my door. I spent the next hour methodically checking every window, every latch, every point of entry. Everything was secure. I reviewed the camera footage again, frame by frame, hoping to catch something I had missed. The draft shimmer was constant, a ghostly presence, but nothing more. The isolation of my cabin, usually a source of peace, now felt like a vulnerability. I tried to contact my nearest neighbor, a trapper who lived about 3 miles down the trail, using my radio. The static was heavy, and the relay delays made communication difficult. After several attempts, I managed to get through, but he had seen no one. No snow machine tracks other than his own, for days. He suggested it might have been an animal, a bear perhaps, though bears were usually denned up by now. The idea felt unconvincing. I decided to conduct a controlled test. I reset the handle to its normal position, then applied a light pressure, mimicking what I imagined had happened. I observed the frost pattern as it formed. It was different from what I had seen that morning. The original pattern had been more diffuse, suggesting a hand, not a paw. I then left the handle in the slightly ajar position, similar to what I had found, and monitored it with the camera. The refreeze timing was slow in the extreme cold, but the frost eventually reformed, creating a new halo. This new halo did not match the one I had photographed. The evidence, though subtle, pointed away from a natural cause. I considered the possibility of a prank, but no one came this far out for such a thing. The nearest town was too distant for casual visitors. The thought of someone approaching my cabin in the dead of night, in such extreme cold, and simply testing the handle was unsettling. It spoke of a deliberate, quiet trespass. I spent the rest of the day on high alert. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the forest made me pause. I checked the perimeter again, walking further out, looking for any sign of a trail that might have been obscured by drifting snow. I found nothing. The forest remained silent, vast, and indifferent. I logged the incident in my logbook, detailing the handle's position, the frost pattern, and the camera's lack of a clear recording. I included the photograph. Later that evening, I managed to get through to the state trooper's dispatch. I filed a report, describing the incident in a calm, factual tone, emphasizing the unusual nature of the handle's position and the disturbed frost. The officer on the line listened patiently, noting the details. He said they would keep an eye out, but with no clear evidence of forced entry or theft, there was little they could do. The file would remain open, a quiet entry in their system. The incident left a lingering impression. I reinforced the door, adding extra bolts and a more robust lock. I adjusted the camera's sensitivity, hoping to capture even the slightest movement. The quiet dread of that morning never fully dissipated. I still checked the handle every morning, my gaze instinctively drawn to its position. The cold outside still carries a certain weight, a reminder of the vast, empty spaces surrounding my cabin. Sometimes, late at night, when the stove pops and the wind whispers through the pines, I imagine a presence just beyond the light, a hand reaching out in the frost. I was performing my routine volunteer communications check from my remote cabin. It was a clear, frigid night in the Alaskan interior, well below freezing. Then my handheld radio, which had been working fine, suddenly displayed a low battery warning. My cabin sits a good distance from the nearest highway, nestled deep within boreal timber near Talkeetna. I maintain a small off-grid setup, relying on solar panels and a backup generator for power. My role involves monitoring local repeater traffic and assisting with emergency relays for trappers and remote residents. This work requires reliable equipment and a keen ear for the subtle sounds of the forest at night. I had been at this location for several years, accustomed to the isolation and the quiet hum of the electronics. The air outside was still, the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak underfoot. Inside, the wood stove cast a warm glow, its occasional pop and crackle the only consistent sound. I had just finished logging a routine check-in from a trapper working a line further north. The radio was a standard VHF handheld, a reliable model I had used for many seasons. I watched the radio's display as the battery icon blinked red, then went dark. The unit powered off completely. This was not unusual. Batteries drain faster in the extreme cold, even when kept indoors. I made a mental note to swap it for a fresh pack in the morning. I placed the dead radio on a small shelf next to the window, its plastic casing cool to the touch. The night outside was a deep, star-filled black, the kind that only true isolation provides. I could hear the faint whisper of the wind through the spruce trees, a sound that often carried for miles across the frozen landscape. I turned my attention to my logbook, noting the time of the last transmission. The cabin was quiet again, save for the low hum of the inverter and the gentle ticking of the stove as it cooled. A few minutes later, the main base station radio, a larger unit connected to an external antenna, emitted a short, sharp squelch tick. This sound indicated an incoming carrier burst, a brief transmission on the frequency I was monitoring. I glanced at the display, expecting to see an ID from one of the regular users. Instead, the screen showed the ID of my handheld radio, the one I had just watched power off due to a dead battery. I stared at the display, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The handheld was still on the shelf, dark and inert. I picked it up, pressing the power button. Nothing. The screen remained blank. I tried again, holding the button down for a few seconds. Still nothing. The battery was undeniably dead. I checked the base station's internal log. It clearly recorded a carrier burst from my handheld's unique identifier, lasting for barely a second. The timestamp was just moments after I had placed the dead radio on the shelf. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. I walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. The frost on the pane obscured my view slightly, but I could make out the faint outline of the forest. There was no light, no movement. The silence outside felt heavier now, more profound. I ran through the possibilities in my mind. A phantom signal? Equipment malfunction? I had never encountered anything like this in all my years of volunteer comms work. The base station was a robust, well-maintained unit, and its logging function was highly reliable. I retrieved a fresh battery pack for the handheld and swapped it out. The radio powered on immediately, its display bright. I performed a quick test transmission, keying up the local repeater. The base station confirmed the signal. Everything seemed normal with the now powered handheld. I then went back to the base station's log, reviewing the entry for the phantom transmission. The data was clear. My handheld's ID, a brief carrier, and the exact time. There was no error message, no indication of a corrupted signal. It was a clean, standard transmission, originating from a radio that should have been completely inert. The implications were unsettling. A dead radio cannot transmit. It simply cannot. I decided to investigate further. My first thought was to check the cabin's power system. I grabbed my voltmeter and headed to the main electrical panel. The panel was located in a small utility closet, its wires neatly organized. I began checking the various circuits, looking for any anomalies. The system was off-grid, powered by a bank of deep-cycle batteries charged by solar panels. The inverter converted the DC power to AC for the cabin's appliances. I systematically checked the voltage and current draw on each circuit. Most readings were normal, consistent with the low power consumption of the cabin at night. Then I noticed a small, persistent draw on one of the auxiliary circuits. It was minimal, barely enough to register, but it was there. This circuit powered a few low-voltage devices, but nothing that should have been active at that moment. The draw was too small to be a major appliance, but it was constant. I traced the wiring as best I could, but it disappeared into the wall behind the panel. I had installed the system myself, and I knew every wire run. This particular draw was unexpected. It was not enough to trip a breaker or cause any noticeable effect on the cabin's power, but it was an unexplained drain. I made a note in my personal logbook detailing the voltage and current readings. The air in the utility closet was colder than the main cabin, and I could feel the chill radiating from the exterior wall. I considered the possibility of a short, but the draw was too stable, too consistent for that. It felt deliberate, almost. I spent the next hour rechecking all my radio equipment, ensuring connections were secure and antennas were properly grounded. I even went outside, walking around the cabin perimeter with a flashlight. The snow was undisturbed, a smooth, unbroken blanket reflecting the faint starlight. There were no fresh tracks, no signs of animal activity, let alone human presence. The cold was intense, biting at my exposed skin. I could hear the faint creak of the frozen timber as the forest settled in the deep cold. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the hard-packed snow. I checked the porch, running my hand along the door handle. It was coated in a thin layer of frost, undisturbed. There were no prints, no evidence of anyone having tested the latch. The isolation felt absolute. Back inside, I reviewed the repeater log again. The entry for the phantom key-up remained, stark and undeniable. I cross-referenced it with my personal logbook, confirming the sequence of events. Dead radio, then transmission. Unexplained power draw. No physical evidence of trespass. The procedural nature of my work demanded an explanation, a logical sequence of cause and effect. This incident defied that logic. I considered filing a formal report with the Alaska State Troopers. But what would I say? That my dead radio transmitted on its own? That there was a tiny, unexplained power draw in my cabin? Without any tangible evidence of a crime or a clear threat, it would sound like a delusion. I decided to keep a closer watch on the repeater logs and the cabin's power panel. For several days, I monitored the auxiliary circuit with the voltmeter. The small draw persisted, a constant, low-level drain. It never fluctuated, never increased. It was just there. I also kept the base station radio logging all traffic, hoping for another phantom key-up. But it never happened again. The incident remained a singular, unrepeatable event. I took photographs of the radio's display showing the ID, and of the voltmeter readings at the panel. I compiled a detailed report from my own records, outlining every step I had taken, every observation I had made. The file grew, filled with technical data and procedural notes, but no answers. The experience left a subtle, lingering unease. The quiet hum of the cabin's electronics now carried a different resonance. The isolation, once a comfort, felt more like an exposure. I still perform my volunteer comms duties, still monitor the frequencies, still maintain my equipment with meticulous care. But sometimes, late at night, when the cabin is quiet and the forest is still, I find myself listening for that specific squelch tick, wondering if the dead radio will ever key up again. I still check the voltmeter on that auxiliary circuit, just to confirm the small, unexplained draw is still there. It always is. I was an early riser, living alone in my remote cabin. The deep winter morning was just beginning to lighten over interior Alaska. A single set of snowshoe tracks led away from my porch. My routine was precise, honed by years of living off-grid in the boreal forest. I woke before dawn, stoked the wood stove, and checked the radio for any static or hum from the morning broadcast. The air inside the cabin was still holding the chill of the night, but the stove's heat was already pushing back against the cold. Outside, the temperature was well below zero, a typical January morning near Fairbanks. I usually stepped out onto the porch to survey the yard, looking for animal signs or any change in the snow. This morning, the light was a pale gray, just enough to reveal the fresh snow cover from the previous night. The tracks were unmistakable, a clear impression of snowshoes in the pristine surface. They started directly beneath the eave of my cabin. My cabin was a small, sturdy structure built for the Alaskan winter. It sat on a slight rise, surrounded by a mix of spruce and birch timber. A single-track trail led from my property to the main highway, about 3 miles away. My nearest neighbor was a few miles further down that same trail. Life here was defined by isolation and self-reliance. Every morning I checked the perimeter, a habit born of necessity and caution. I looked for signs of moose, lynx, or the occasional wolf pack. Human tracks were rare, usually my own or those of a known visitor. The snow was a natural logbook, recording every passage. This particular morning, the snow had fallen steadily for several hours overnight, a light, dry powder that settled evenly. There had been no wind to obscure any marks. The snowshoe tracks began directly under the eave, where the roofline met the wall of the cabin. There was no disturbance in the snow leading up to that point. No scuff marks, no drag lines, no other footprints of any kind. It was as if the person had materialized there, already wearing snowshoes. I stepped off the porch, careful to place my own snowshoes well away from the existing trail. The crust of the snow crunched under my weight, a sound that carried far in the cold, still air. I knelt down, examining the first set of prints. They were clear, distinct, showing the mesh pattern of a modern snowshoe. The stride length was consistent, indicating a steady, deliberate pace. I followed the tracks away from the cabin. They led in a straight line, heading directly towards the dense timberline that marked the edge of my property. The snow was about a foot deep, and the tracks were well defined, showing the full impression of the snowshoe and the slight depression of a boot heel. I walked slowly, scanning the snow on either side of the trail. My eyes searched for any deviation, any sign of an approach. There was nothing. The snow was smooth, unbroken, a uniform blanket of white. The only marks were the outbound snowshoe prints. I walked for about 100 yards, reaching the edge of the forest. The tracks continued into the trees, disappearing among the trunks and deeper drifts. I turned back, retracing my steps, keeping a wide berth from the original trail. I needed to confirm what my eyes were telling me. I walked in a wide arc, circling the area where the tracks began. I expanded my search, moving further out, creating a fan-shaped pattern around the cabin. The snow was undisturbed. There were no other tracks, no signs of anyone having walked up to the cabin or having approached from any direction. The only marks were the ones leading away. It was an impossible scenario. Someone had left my cabin, but they had not arrived. The cold air felt sharper, the silence of the forest more profound. I returned to the cabin, my mind working through the implications. I checked the door. The heavy timber door was secured with a deadbolt. The frost pattern on the inside of the door was unbroken, a delicate lacework of ice crystals. If the door had been opened, even for a moment, that frost would have been disturbed, leaving a clear mark. I ran my gloved hand over the latch. The metal was cold, covered in a thin layer of rime. There were no fresh prints on the frost, no sign of a recent touch. I checked the windows. They were all latched from the inside, and the condensation on the panes was undisturbed. The cabin had been sealed, impenetrable. I retrieved my camera and a measuring rod. I began documenting the scene methodically. I took a series of photographs, starting from the first snowshoe print under the eave. I used the measuring rod to record the length and width of the prints, the depth of the impression, and the stride length. I photographed the unbroken snow leading up to the starting point of the tracks. I photographed the door, the windows, the undisturbed frost. My hands were cold, but my focus was absolute. This was not an animal. This was human. The evidence was clear, yet it defied logic. The stove's steady hum was the only sound inside the cabin, a stark contrast to the quiet dread building within me. I spent the next few hours expanding my search. I put on my heavier parka and took my snow machine. I rode in ever-widening circles around the cabin, covering a radius of about a mile. I checked the main trail, looking for any sign of a snow machine or a person approaching on foot. The trail was pristine, marked only by my own tracks from the previous day. I checked the frozen creek beds, often used as travel routes in winter. They were smooth, covered in the same fresh, undisturbed snow. The forest was silent, the only sounds the distant caw of a raven and the low rumble of my snow machine. The sun was now fully up, casting long shadows, but it offered no clarity. I returned to the cabin, the cold seeping into my bones. I tried the radio again. The static was heavy, the signal weak. It was a common occurrence in this remote region, especially with the aurora activity sometimes interfering with transmissions. I needed to reach the Alaska State Troopers. This was beyond a simple trespass. The lack of an inbound trail was the critical detail, the one that made no sense. I reviewed my photographs, looking for any detail I might have missed. Every image confirmed the same impossible fact. The tracks began at the cabin and led away, with no preceding path. I considered every possibility: a helicopter drop, a hidden approach through the dense undergrowth, but none fit the pristine snow. I finally managed to get a weak signal through to dispatch. The connection was poor, full of crackling static. I explained the situation, keeping my voice calm and factual. I described the tracks, the lack of an inbound trail, the undisturbed cabin. The dispatcher listened patiently, asking a few procedural questions. They logged my report and said they would send someone out when conditions allowed. It would be a long journey for them, several hours by snow machine from the nearest outpost. I knew I would be alone with this mystery for a while longer. The isolation of the cabin pressed in on me, heavier than before. I spent the rest of the day inside, checking the perimeter periodically from the windows. The tracks remained, stark against the white snow. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The cold deepened. I kept the stove roaring, its heat a small comfort against the vastness outside. I thought about the stride math, the consistent pattern of the snowshoes. It was not an animal, not a trick of the light or a drift of snow. It was a person, leaving my cabin, having never arrived. The quiet dread settled deep within me. The Alaska State Troopers arrived the following afternoon. They were thorough, professional. They examined the tracks, took their own photographs, and confirmed my observations. They walked the perimeter, searched the surrounding timber, and found nothing. No other tracks, no discarded items, no explanation. They filed a report, noting the unusual circumstances. The incident was logged, but without any clear resolution. There was no evidence of forced entry, no theft, no apparent crime beyond the impossible trespass. The case remained open, a strange entry in their file. I still live in my cabin, but the feeling of isolation has changed. The forest whispers differently now. I check the snow every morning with a new intensity, a quiet vigilance. I still think about those tracks sometimes, the way they just began, then ended. The silence of the forest never felt the same after that morning. If this story pulled you in, make sure to subscribe. We post new ones every day, steady as a campfire burning in the dark. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which part of tonight's story stayed with you the most. It's always wild seeing what hits people across different places.